The Lord be with you. That's a traditional greeting that dates back to the Church of England in the 16th century. It's the same one that the American colonists used, and it's still the one we use today. I'm the Reverend Dr. Lynn Rinaldi, and I'm honored to be the 16th rector of historic Pohick Church. During this virtual tour, we'd like to share our nearly 300-year-old history. As you listen to each part of the story, I hope you'll discern the spirit that formed our colonial ancestors, the spirit that shaped a nation, and the spirit that still guides us here today. Here at Pohick Church, George Washington, George Mason, and many other patriot families were spiritually formed. In fact, I'm sitting here in George Washington's family pew. Their Christian values and the Anglican ethos of moderation, balance, and tolerance deeply influenced their mission. Ultimately, their Christ-centered vision shaped the foundations of a great democracy, one nation under God, indivisible. Indivisible, no division, no intolerance, no extremes, united in love of neighbor and in pursuit of freedom and happiness. These days, it seems our nation has veered far from their vision. Perhaps our colonial spiritual ancestors have much to teach us today. We begin their story with the English colonists' arrival on the shores of Virginia. They originally came not to escape, but to establish a colony as English people in America. They brought everything they could from merry old England. This included their devotion to His Majesty the King, and as a matter of course, they brought their Anglican or English church, called the Church of England. They also demonstrated the English genius for adapting old forms of government and church to new forms of living. So the church institutions of parish and vestry in Virginia evolved from their origins in the old country. In the New World, the Act of 1642 established that parish boundaries were no longer fixed by tradition and appointed by royalty. In the colonies, parishes were determined by statute, and leaders were elected in an annual meeting of tithable parishioners. In those days, a parish functioned somewhat like what we call a county today. Parish boundaries spanned a wide geographic region and might include several churches within it. Every 4 years, the vestry and clergy would walk the boundaries of all tracts of lands, checking and renewing landmarks, and maintaining roads and bridges. The parish was governed by 12 elected leaders called a vestry. Their duties were not merely to build and maintain church and select and support clergy. They also functioned as the community's morality police, akin to local magistrates. They also ensured the care of widows and orphans, often apprenticing orphans as indentured servants so that they could learn a trade. Thus, in the early days of colonial Virginia, a more democratic, electable form of government was already born in the church. Vestry members were well trained in governing before they ever made it to Williamsburg or eventually to Philadelphia. Already, the vestry's autonomy in selecting clergy became a sticking point with the crown. This was the beginning of many conflicts, a harbinger of the quest for freedom that would shape the American Revolution. The forerunner of Pohick Church was a chapel at the port of Colchester called the Occoquan Church. Mentioned in 1724 correspondence between the Bishop of London and Reverend Alexander Scott, the Occoquan Church was the first permanent church in Virginia north of the Occoquan River, where Colchester was an important deep-water seaport for local tobacco plantations. In 1732, Hamilton Parish was divided into 2 distinct parishes, one of which was named Truro Parish. The vestry of the newly formed Truro Parish was seated at Pohick Church. The name Pohick likely was given to the church because of its proximity to Pohick Creek. Many church members traveled to church by that water. Pohick probably comes from the Native American name, Pohickory, referring to the hickory trees along the creek's banks. Known as the Mother Church of Northern Virginia, that original Pohick church was a wooden structure. It was near the corner of Old Colchester and Gunston Roads, at the site of this marker. Elected to Pohick's vestry in November of 1735 was none other than Augustine Washington himself, George Washington's father. The Washington plantation, Mount Vernon, was about 6 miles away, a ride that took several hours by carriage or horse. The Washington family donated this silver chalice stamped with the date 1732 to Pohick Church. How do we know all this? Vestries kept detailed minutes of meetings. Pohick Church recently loaned Mount Vernon our original handwritten vestry minutes, spanning the years of 1732 to 1785. Today, these minutes reside in the Fred W. Smith National Library for the study of George Washington. They recorded not only Augustine's election to the vestry in 1735, but also his son George's vestry election nearly 30 years later in 1763. General Washington remained on Pohick's vestry, often serving as warden for 23 years. George Washington and his fellow Pohickian and friend George Mason agreed on several important principles influenced by their Christian and Anglican formation. They co-authored the Fairfax Resolves, precursor to the Virginia Bill of Rights, and eventually the U.S. Constitution's Bill of Rights. Language and ideas from the Fairfax Resolves are found in the Declaration of Independence as well. However, the two disagreed on less weighty matters. When the old wooden church on Colchester began to age, Pohick's vestry decided to build a new brick church. Mason campaigned for the new church to be built on the same spot, minutes from his farm on Gunston Road, of course. However, Washington made the case for a more populated area. Using demographic data and surveying a high point on the area, it shows on the surveyor's map drawn by Washington that he recommended the spot that was closer to Mount Vernon. Ironically, it would not require crossing Pohick Creek by horse. Washington won that debate. Pohick Church built this current Georgian structure with its box pews sold to parishioners to cover the costs of the church. It was completed in 1774, just 2 years before the Revolutionary War commenced. We know that the Fairfax Resolves were first read here on the steps of Pohick Church, and we suspect that it was also here as one of the first places that the Declaration of Independence was first read to the community. Of course, after the Revolutionary War, Americans no longer answered to the British monarch in either political or ecclesiastical matters. Like everything else, the American church was severed from the Church of England, so there were no Anglican clergy being ordained for America. A post-war financial crisis and a shortage of ordained clergy led to a brief period of church decline here. In 1789, however, the American Episcopal Church, similar to its English mother, the Church of England, was born. Priests became available to preach again and to celebrate the Eucharist. The Reverend Lee Massey, friend of George Washington and a colonial rector of Pohick, is buried under the pulpit. Revolutionary War officers, soldiers, other patriots, and priests are buried in and near the courtyard around the church. To this day, we are Pohick Episcopal Church under the umbrella of the Episcopal Diocese of Virginia. The Episcopal Church is part of the worldwide Anglican Communion. Our presiding bishop in the United States is one of many national church bishops in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury in England still. Like all Anglicans, we still worship using the Book of Common Prayer. The Holy Eucharist, baptism, and other sacraments, as well as the Psalter and the daily office, are contained in an American version of the Book of Common Prayer that was created originally by the Church of England. The architecture of Pohick Church was influenced by Reformation theology. Notice the colonial pulpit. How can you help but notice it? It immediately commands your attention. Raised high, it's hard to miss. Lest colonial parishioners got distracted by their neighboring worshipers, the walls of their tall pews focused their eyes and their ears on the Word of God. In contrast with the impressive pulpit, the more Catholic sacramental altar for consecrating the Eucharist was smaller, less significant. Historically, Anglican theology balances both word and sacrament, or both Protestant and Catholic spirituality. This is the original baptismal font commissioned for Pohick Church. And then when this brick structure was built, a font that was once a mortar and pestle in England, in a monastery there, dating to the year 1000, was located on a farm in the Mason Neck, and it was moved here. Ever since, this font has been used for hundreds of baptisms and still is used for baptisms at Pohick. At Pohick Church, we like to say, "Come for the history, but stay for the lively and loving community of faith here." To this day, Pohickians embody our spiritual ancestors' incarnational spirituality of prayer, of moderation, service, and balance. Like them, we are formed in the Anglican ethos of the both and. We embody our belief in the love and mercy of Christ, and we warmly invite you to come experience the living spirit of Pohick's colonial ancestors as we bridge heritage and future in today's world. The Lord be with you.